Hello and welcome to Broadsword Wargaming. My name is Ollie and in this video I'm going to show you how I turned a Playmobil Kids Colosseum set into a really cool piece of scenery for Warcry Arena. Games Workshop's latest fantasy offerings are amazing and I really wanted to do them justice by building a board worthy of their sculpts. I'm going to talk you through every step of this build from the start to the finish. To begin with, I got a 4-foot circular table. This is a Colosseum set, it is a circle, and I just felt a square board might look a little bit odd. I managed to pick this up for free from a local trading site on Facebook over here in Ireland. A really good find, it took me a while, but I got it in the end. The Playmobil set is a proper kid's toy. It's 3 foot across, so it's quite large, larger than I actually thought it would be once the board build had kind of started. The table's pretty big and it's quite daunting. It's a cool looking set, obviously has lots of kids elements to it, easy to put together. You can see there it has some sort of more Lego-esque statues which I won't be using and several other bits as well there that I decided to keep off it. Laying it out and putting it together is really simple. It has lots of little clips and little pins to hold the whole thing together. It isn't super rigid once it's together, so it will need some work to make sure this doesn't separate once I've started building it. But where do we go from here? How do I decide what to do with this? The first real thing for me was to make sure the board was central. I know it would annoy the hell out of me if I have a circular board on a circular table and it isn't straight. Using the Gaming Scenics modelling compound, I'm going to use this to hold the whole thing in place and make sure it doesn't come apart. I love this stuff. I use it for all of my dioramas, all my board builds and even on bases. It's quite simple, much like Sculpt-A-Mold, it's a dry, powdery consistency. You add water to it, making sure it gets to something like tuna mayo or egg mayonnaise, that kind of consistency. Something you can mold, not too wet. This is probably a tiny bit too wet here that you can see, but I do want to make sure it gets underneath and into all those cracks so the whole board doesn't move at all. Just keep tapping it, patting it, and then once it's started to dry, you can rub it with a wet finger just to smooth it out and to pull off any dry crackled edges, eventually giving you something like this. This is now smooth, it's relatively flat to the table, it's not sticking out anywhere. Not that it matters too much because it's going to get covered by ground covers anyway. This took about 15 minutes to set, which is great because it allows me to carry on with the rest of the build. This next section was quite tricky. I had so many different plans and had actually asked on different Facebook groups what I should do. I had dreams of clipping out and removing all the plastic from each of the arches, giving me a full see-through thing, but as you can see I resorted to a saw because clippers just wouldn't hack it. This plastic is solid, it will not break, it's quite rigid and doesn't snap easily either, so a big old saw was the only way I could break big enough sections off this, meaning there wasn't a lot of room for intricate plastic sculpting or breaking of this product. It was just rip and then get me some sort of damaged things. I didn't want it to look like the straight toy it was, so I just figured adding a bit of battle damage and maybe making this overrun and old was probably the way to go. I did actually think about making it green and overgrown, but having spoken to a few different people, desert just seemed to fit the theme. With that in mind, limestone seemed like the way to do this. I had thought about using glue and dropping fine grout all over it. That seemed quite time consuming, so I found this spray can out in the local builder's yard. I wasn't sure what it's like, I'd never used it before, so I thought I'd give it a little test and see how it turned out. I was actually really impressed with it, and it had a nice texture to it. Not too much that it filled anything in, or covered any gaps, or looked like anything other than limestone. Very impressed, even though it came in around £14 a can, it was worth it. Next up was just to add a bit of detail and a bit of colour to this. I didn't want it to be a flat, boring piece of terrain. I got the Desert Brown from Army Painter, but again, you could use any different spray can you like. And just spray this to the lower parts of the buildings. Then use the Chalk Furniture Paint, which does have a texture again, to the top elements, giving me sort of a nice colour transition from the white at the top all the way down to the light brown at the bottom. With the main work looking a little bit more interesting and less like a toy, it was on to details. Using some wallpaper I'd had from a previous build, just to make some cobblestone floors, I wanted to make a small road for the way in. I wasn't sure how I was going to go around this. I did think about putting it down the sides of the board as well to look like old pavements, but I just didn't feel there was enough room around the board. There was about 6 inches from the edge of the table through to the side of the Colosseum. Using some high-grade PVA glue here, again from Gaming Scenics, I just smothered the whole area and stuck this onto it. Push it down. It does take a while to dry. It is a wallpaper, so Like any wallpaper, it takes ages to do anything, but it's quite a nice finish in the end, and I've used this before in previous builds and on bases and have always been very impressed with how it turns out. Now onto my first time ever using blue foam. I'd only really used this for very, very small cobblestones on bases and wasn't really sure how I'd end up getting the kind of result I wanted here. I cut a circle out and intended on using this for the very center of the table to break up the whole build itself so it wasn't just sand. Having used some fine sandpaper around the end to make sure it didn't bevel too much, I again used the high grade PVA to glue this to the center. Pushing it down, there are other ways to do this, but I was wary of melting it as well. But as you can see, looking through the doors here, it's flat, it's quite smooth, and it's quite clean. I will be messing this up as it is an overgrown, damaged board, but the effect and the result is there in the center. Using a compass, I drew more circles around the inside of this, leading to the very center. I wanted it to have a circular stone cobble finish, but I didn't want to hand draw it all myself as it would be quite wonky. Having then first drawn it down with a pencil, I used another pencil and then biros and all sorts of things to widen the gap. Hacking it up using clippers, knives, I kind of missed a bit of that there, but all I did was scribe and draw it and ruin it and wreck it until I kind of felt it looked nice enough. It wasn't a particularly difficult process, it's kind of just a bit of trial and error and just keep going at it, depending on how damaged you want this to be. It's not something you can mess up too much because the whole board is going to get covered in grouts and soils and sands anyway. So if there's anything you're not happy with, you can cover it up and move on. To make this secure and solid, I use Mod Podge. Again, I've not used this though, had it in the drawer for a while. This is kind of a PVA with a varnish, I think, mixed into it. And what this will do is it keeps the foam, which is already quite stiff, and makes it a little bit harder, meaning it doesn't damage when being used or through miniature wear. I don't want to damage this board having spent so long doing it or snap or break the foam. And it is going to be a playable table surface, so I would advise doing this. You can add black paint to this as well to sort of do a 2-in-1 and get a primer down on there as well. Next is actually colouring the stuff. Now I didn't use black, I ended up using a browny ochre type colour as this is going to be a limestone finish. Cheap old pound shop crafter's paint, it doesn't really matter if this is particularly see-through. I'm just using this to make sure it's covered because I will then go back onto it with some spray cans. The issue with using spray cans on blue foam is it will melt it. It's not necessarily the paint that melts it, but it's the actual propellants that melt the foam. And that is not something you want when you just spend an hour engraving all of your blue foam. I then hit it with the same spray cans I used earlier, the limestone one, the brown one, and the white chalky one to try and match the walls. Now it is a different material, a different texture, and it does absorb paint differently. So it doesn't look exactly the same, but it's close enough that I think I can manage with it. I did the same for the bit of road I'd made at the start. I decided not to do much more with this other than leave it there and not move it around the side of the table. Next was the start of an interesting part of this project and definitely the most time consuming. Was it the most time efficient? I'm not sure, but I was quite happy with the finish in the end. Using Winsor and Newton oil along with odorless thinner, I decided to apply oils to each of the recesses on the board. This was a lot of work. I actually improved and sped up as it went along, but what I was doing was trying to pin wash essentially the entire board. You do need to be relatively accurate, but using the thinner afterwards to tidy up, you can actually blend this in so it looks like a dirty, blended, rough, built up grime section on the board going into where the nice clean sections would be. You can use this for any imperfections as well, any bits of the limestone spray that's overhung and built up, or even indeed for any ground coverings that will eventually get there. This is what you do, you just use the thinner after you've drawn it in to blend it in and make it a nice soft transition. You can clearly see the few bits I've done to the bits I haven't done, and it does look a lot better. It just takes a very long time. There are something like 64 arches, both inside and outside of the board, so about 128. Then you've got the entrance part as well, all the upper and lower lips and inside the initial gatehouse area. I gave you this in time lapse, but I think I started this around 12, sort of midnight, and finished up around 4:30, then came back in the morning and did several more hours worth of work. But we got there in the end. It was mind-numbingly boring, and Captain Janeway and Voyager got me through this small section. It looks a lot better for it though. It's dirty, it's yellower. You could go with a brown colour, and I did think about that, having tried a little bit of it, but actually I was pretty happy with the colours I got. Next up, I used Ushabti Bone and Screaming Skull on a dry brush to match the inside of this stone circle. I had done this with oils as well, then dabbed them off with a tissue and dry brushed it. After maybe 10 or more hours on the project so far, I finally get to move on to the part I love, and that is doing all the ground covers. Using PVA glue, you just make sure you get this well covered, bash it up the sides a little bit so it looks like the sand has blown up the sides, and get in all of those cracks and crevices, as well in some of the broken stone in the centre, as we are going to use the Geek Gaming base ready desert sand and stone and tropical beach, along with some grout, to make up the ground of this project. I started with the desert sand and stone, as this is larger and rougher and has larger chunks of stone in it. Use this to simulate the broken parts of the board and start there, then move into any other patches you want where you just don't want it to be flat and boring. Don't be afraid to throw it right in all the different parts of the board, because you want this to be the fallen rocks. Don't forget the rubble and the offcuts as well, because if you've pulled any parts off, it would be weird if they just weren't there anymore. I probably should have done this before I applied the base ready, but it's not a problem because I will go back over this again anyway. Find the correct pieces, put them down somewhere as if they've fallen relatively naturally away from the area they were broken apart from. I have colosseum sections on here and wanted these to look nice, so I put one on the top and one down on the ground as well as if they'd fallen over. Then go in with the tropical sand. This is now finer. You can use other types of sand as well, just make sure it's in scale. You want it to be small and fine. The problem I find with a lot of the playground sands is they're too big and the bits of grit don't look right to the correct scale of the models we're doing. I've covered the whole board with watered down PVA, just normal PVA, watered down maybe 4 parts to 1. Then come back in with grout, and this is what's going to hold all these pieces in shape. The grout is amazing. It's a very pale sand as well, but it will hold and dry really firm and set nice and solid so the whole board won't break apart when you start using it. One odd issue is I ended up with some cracks around the base where I'd used the modelling compound. I think the PVA and the grout had shrunk a little bit and caused it to pull away. The whole structure was still nice and firm. It didn't really matter as you could just cover it up anyway, but just an interesting thing, and I'm not entirely sure why that happened. Moving on to another first for me, I'm going to use a static grass applicator. Now, using the Geek Gaming Fast Dry basing glue, I'm going to lay this down on some baking paper, non-stick baking paper, little globs, and I'm going to use a static grass applicator to create my own tufts. I obviously have tufts I can use, but they're quite small, so what I'm looking for here is to replicate the kind of grass you get in deserts. Get the glue down, then use a paintbrush or whatever you want to flatten the areas out, as this needs to be quite thin because we're going to use it to stick to and then peel off and stick to the board. I'm using things around the size of a 20-cent piece. For those of you in England, that's like smaller than a 10p. In America, I'm not quite sure, a dime. Then I use a couple of static grasses, the dead ones and the spring ones, along with the Green Scenics static grass applicator. I have seen people use homemade ones. I haven't really tried that myself. I've never used this before, although it comes very well recommended from Luke from Geek Gaming Scenics. Load up the applicator, make sure the pieces aren't stuck together. This was my second attempt as the first one did fail. The problem I had in the first attempt was I shook the grass applicator up and down, when really you need to keep it very low to the paper and shake it side to side. This will help the grass stand up, and it actually was quite simple. It just took me maybe half an hour to get the hang of it completely. Some on this sheet weren't totally usable. I found the longer grass, the 6mm, 4mm stuff was better for what I wanted to do than the 2mm. I didn't end up using much of the 2mm. You just then pick it up, shake it off, blow it off, and this is how it looks. It actually looks like actual tufts, stuff you'd get in the desert. Really impressed. Quite simple, quite easy, and something I will use again on different products. Using a scraper, I just use this to get underneath the grass onto the glue. You can see it's a little bit stodgy, but actually it's quite simple and it does bung together. Then using this and some actual tufts I have, so again 6mm smaller dead tufts, I just put a bit of basing glue on the bottom of any tufts I used and stuck them onto the table. I did this all over the board. If you look at pictures of deserts, you'll find the grass tends to glow together in its own little clumps, along with clumps out in the middle of nowhere, and I was pretty happy with the result we got here. I used the matte Scenic sealant spray from Geek Gaming Scenics, although you could use a matte varnish, just to cover the entire board to make sure everything was nice and solid and stuck down. At this point, I'd neglected to do anything with any of the metal parts to this board. I ended up going with Warp Block Bronze mixed in with Agrax Earthshade. I was sent a picture of Gladiator, one of the best films ever, by one of the patrons, and he suggested going this kind of bronzy colour. I didn't want to go metal because I didn't find metal rusted in pictures of the desert. It's too dry, so you don't end up with that rusty finish. I wanted something I could weather, and you do still get verdigris on bronze, brass and gold out in Pictures of the Desert. This board actually comes with some really cool little pieces. It has some flame candelabra type holders as well, and once I'd got these down and left them to dry, you end up adding some really nice details to the board itself. It now breaks up that deserty, sandy colour we have everywhere and really starts to pull the whole board together. I was quite impressed with how these fitted in, and they didn't look too cheap and toy-esque once you'd painted them. I let those dry and then covered them in the Citadel Technical, the Nihilak oxide. Don't know how you pronounce that really, but this is essentially the verdigris. You can do this with green turquoise-esque paints as well. I have this anyway, and I found you can do this in two ways. You can cover the entire thing in it, or you can just cover the lower sections. Now, I wanted the board to be broken up a bit, so I dabbed it off with a cloth and then came back over with a dry brush of the original colour. This just pulled it back a little bit, made it look less tatty and made it look a little bit more realistic. I kind of remember my granddad's brass decorations in his house and how we used to have to polish those, so I went for that kind of finish. Then a bit of blood for the blood god, because it is a gladiatorial ring, and just spattered blood up the walls, a bit over the centre. I just loaded the brush up and then flicked it off. You can do this with an airbrush as well and just blow bits off, and you end up with a really nice little patches of blood around. I didn't go OTT because I figured once I put this on this kind of board, it would be very difficult to get off, especially when it's dried into the grout and into the bases. But yeah, that is essentially the whole board, and I am now really happy with how these details came together. I don't know what you guys think to this, but I'm quite happy. I covered the whole thing with matte varnish just to protect it and make sure it dried the blood out a little bit more. I also added some statues up to the top of the marble pillars, and there they are in all their glory. I painted them the same way I painted the brass, but with a more of a coppery highlight. The chains here link up nicely. You could put fire into those places if you wanted as well. You could also stick barrels in or dead corpses. I broke a few other bits and really started to get some nice details out of this board. I was really happy, and I cannot wait to get some games on this. These are Kira's models and my models. We will be doing a Warcry Arena battle report at some point. If you've enjoyed this video, please do make sure you like, share and subscribe, and hit the alarm bell below for more videos. All of the products I've mentioned are available in the descriptions. I have my own shop now where I sell all of these scenic things, not the Playmobil, but everything else, as well as some miniatures. So I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will catch you again in another video. Take care.